In season 2 of the Best of Health podcast, I am shining a spotlight on all of the life stages of women's health, from menarche to post-menopause. Topics covered will range literally from head to toe, addressing migraines to vaginal health and everything in between. My conversations are going to be with leading experts in their field, and we will tap into a deep well of knowledge and uncover an array of clinical pearls which promise to be an illuminating and helpful support to your personal health journey. So grab a cuppa and join me this autumn for the Best of Health Season 2, Women's Health Uncovered. Welcome back to the Best of Health podcast Season 2. We're shining the spotlight on all things women's health. And today I have another fantastic friend and dear colleague of mine, Robyn Puglia, what a name, who is a fellow clinical nutritional therapist and a functional medicine practitioner, fully certified functional medicine practitioner. And Robyn is particularly involved in the area of and field of celiac disease and has been for many, many years, and gluten reactivity and autoimmune disease as a whole, which we are going to be digging into today. And she is just one of the most spectacular brains that I have ever come across in this industry. And I just love interacting and chatting with her, which I'm sure all of you will agree with when we get started. Robyn, just to give you a little bit of background, she trained at the Institute of Optimum Nutrition, and then, as I've said, she went on to qualify as a functional medicine practitioner. And in fact, we were in the same cohort and sat our final exam on the same day, which I remember very, very clearly embedded in my mind. Mm-hmm. So, Robyn is also a mum to 3 girls, and she lectures. If that wasn't enough, she spends a lot of her time digging into the research and lecturing for numerous institutions, and she is one of the founding directors of AFMMP, which is the Applied Functional Medicine Mentoring group here in the UK, and it is an invaluable mentoring program for any healthcare professional that is interested in continuing to educate themselves. So Robyn, without further ado, thank you and welcome to my little podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me on and for that very warm and lovely introduction.
You're welcome. So Robyn, I sort of intimated that you have a specialist and particular interest in all areas of the gut and celiac disease and gluten reactivity. Mm-hmm. And I have a little insight as into why, but could you maybe illuminate to our guests and our listeners why that is? What is your story around that, Robyn?
All right. Well, so my life story is long and thoroughly unconventional, but my autoimmune story is actually pretty typical. So, and it goes like this. So I had symptoms of immune dysfunction from about the age of 5, which is around the time we moved to Australia. So it started with eczema, and the eczema covered my legs and spread around my body for years. So my forehead, my hands, my elbows, but always my whole legs, and especially every winter when vitamin D levels, of course, drop. And it was weeping and bleeding and awful, right? That was a big kind of scourge of my childhood. But then, and that was the first real symptom. But then as the years went on, I kept on collecting symptoms. So at the age of 7, I developed classical migraines, and I had those probably 1 or 2 a month from the age of 7 through. They got a little bit better when I hit puberty, but they didn't go away until I went gluten-free in my 20s. I had lots of infections, so urinary tract infections, chest infections, sinus infections, and my infections never really cleared up. They just kind of kept on flaring up. And then when I was 15, I got glandular fever and my energy never really recovered from that. At 16, I was diagnosed with iron deficient anemia and I started getting regular iron injections because oral iron therapy was completely ineffective. I had hypersensitive skin and I flushed and blushed and reacted with blotches and splotches at every little provocation, emotional or physical. So if I had an eyebrow wax, they'd be red for a week. Like, it just didn't, any inflammation didn't really calm down.
Gosh.
When I was 23, I just hit this really big wall. I was exhausted. I couldn't even string a sentence together because I was so tired and my brain just was completely fatigued. I was drained. So I thought for sure at that point, it'd been going on for so long and it'd been so kind of progressive. I thought I had cancer or something like that. I was also very underweight. I was very, very skinny. You could see all my bones. So, and I'd been seeing GPs since I was 5 and just getting all of the usual band-aids. So antibiotics and Sudafed and the contraceptive pill and steroid creams and iron injections. But I got really, really fed up with being told that nothing was wrong. So I was living in Australia at that time. I was in Perth, and in Perth at that time, there was a women's health practice in the center of the city that only had women working there and only saw women, and they dealt with a really full spectrum of women's health issues, including domestic abuse and addiction and homeless, young mothers, homelessness and things like that. So I decided to go there in the hopes that somebody might listen to me or that they might have more bandwidth to do something different. So I had to wait 3 months to get an appointment, but that gave me some time to prepare. And I went in with an entire list of all of my issues. And the doctor said to me really within like 10 minutes, look, you're underweight. You have noticed that your eczema improves a little bit if you stop eating wheat, and I'm going to test you for celiac disease.
Oh my goodness, my jaw is on the desk. I can't, this is sort of like a classic client walking into our clinic.
Yeah, exactly. So this is what I'm telling you. My story is really typical. But when she said that, I immediately knew that that's what it was. I knew it. I just like, my body went, yes. So, but my bloods were positive. I got sent for an endoscopy. The endoscopy showed total villus atrophy. And that was it. That was the start of my gluten-free life. So that was just before I turned 24. It was literally, I had the endoscopy results 2 weeks before I moved to the UK. So I ate as much pizza as I possibly could for that 2 weeks. I ordered myself a gluten-free meal on the plane, and that was my delineation into my gluten-free life. So then when I was 20, so that was 24. And then when I was 25, I discovered the Institute for Optimum Nutrition and I started studying nutrition. And then I discovered when I was like 28, 29, I discovered the celiac community. And then that led me to working with, first of all, other celiacs, but then more and more other people with autoimmunity, and then eventually in the complex cases as well, as I started studying functional medicine and understanding more about the interconnectedness of the immune system and of the whole sort of systems as well.
Gosh, well, that makes me feel quite old because realizing how long we've known each other.
Yeah, we were young when we met.
You pretty much just got off the plane. Goodness me. Okay. That is just, I haven't heard you sort of go back and tell that sort of, I guess, your story in such detail. And it is incredible that it took so long to diagnose. Absolutely incredible. Is there any autoimmunity in your family history?
So yes is the answer. So my dad's side of the family, my dad has got 3 brothers and 3 sisters, and he's got a very strong family history of cancer. Okay. So people in his family die really young of cancer, and a lot of them have bowel cancer. So I am the first person who was diagnosed with celiac disease, but since then, one of my dad's sisters has been diagnosed with ankylosing spondylitis. Her daughter has got celiac disease. My dad has got rheumatoid arthritis, and I kind of think that actually our long history of bowel cancer and various different cancers is probably secondary to undiagnosed autoimmunity or undiagnosed celiac disease.
How fascinating. Gosh.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and that very much segues then into sort of my next sort of thought pattern of sort of could you explain sort of to some of the client people listening what actually sort of, could you unpick what autoimmunity is? And
yeah, so at the heart of it, autoimmune disease actually happens because the immune system is doing exactly what it is supposed to do, which is it's trying to protect us against a harmful foreign agent of some kind. So the problem with autoimmune disease is that the immune system actually loses its ability to recognize our own body as self. So it's acting as if it is dealing with a dangerous stranger. So as if we were an infection, or as if we were, a foreign body of some kind. And that's where it gets interesting for me, is because it's why and how does that happen? So how do we lose the ability to recognize our own tissue as our own tissue? So at the core of that, for many cases, it's because the part of the body or because the tissue in question has been damaged or changed in some way. So it's not recognizable as self to the immune system anymore. So it might be damaged by an infection of some kind, like a viral infection or a bacterial infection, or it can be damaged or changed by a chemical. Or an environmental toxin. So, something common in our environment like BPA, which is found in seats and in plastic drinking bottles, or it could be mercury that is leaching into the tissue at a very low level. It doesn't take large amounts of anything to cause issues with autoimmunity if you're susceptible. So it can be mercury coming from your dental work, just as an example. Or our tissues might become damaged by oxidative stress. So oxidative stress is a normal cellular process that happens. But when we don't have enough antioxidants from our diet, or or for any other reason, then oxidative stress becomes overactive inside the body, and this makes the cells sort of rusty. And if you can imagine, so if you visualize that, if you imagine what a nail looks like when it's bright and shiny and new, and you understand that if that's what you were looking for, and instead you found an old rusty nail that was red and pitted, the shape is the same, but they don't really look like the same thing. So when we're oxidizing our DNA, or when we're oxidizing our fats, then it's not really recognizable to the immune system as being self anymore. And so the immune system has this kind of stranger danger mechanism that can lead to autoimmunity because the parts of the body is actually changed.
That analogy. Love that analogy.
So that's kind of mechanism number one, where the body itself becomes damaged or changed in some way. And hormones can do that as well, actually. So hormones have the ability to change our tissue if they're not being metabolized in a balanced and healthy way. Or the other side of that is that our immune system, there might be something that is affecting our immune system's ability to perform that recognition process adequately. So if you think about, in order to perform that recognition, the immune system has to have the right cells to do that. So think about that, like the immune system needs to wear glasses.
Yep.
And in order to see clearly, you have to wear these glasses. But you also have to take care of the glasses. So we all know that people that wear glasses lose them, put them down, can't find them, that sort of thing. So if you're not getting enough sleep, right, if you get less than 7 hours of sleep a night or less than 5 hours of sleep a night, you're constantly losing your glasses, right? Your immune system can't find your glasses. So it becomes much more difficult to see clearly what is self and what is not self. Stress can do that as well. People that live in a constant state of stress because of work deadlines or because of caring for children or elderly or infirm relatives or anything like that. If you've got a history of childhood trauma, that can change the ability of the immune system to be able to see clearly. So infections can do that as well. And so the messages that the immune system is getting and giving are changed because we can't see clearly what's self and what's not self, or what's dangerous and what's not dangerous. So So it kind of ends up functioning all the time in this stranger danger mode. Or you know what, it can also be a combination of two or more of those variables at the same time. So it's not always, autoimmunity is not always anything.
No,
But
no.
so
Yeah.
part of working with people with autoimmunity is being able to really tell the person's story and understand in your body, which mechanisms are we dealing with? Like, what is it that's causing the immune system, who is trying so hard to do its job, to not be able to do its job properly? Is it because it can't see properly, or is it because it's working with something that's damaged? Is it a combination of those two things? What is it for you?
Brilliant. I love that, Robyn. Thank you so much. And it's so interesting how it's using these different analogies to explain really complex concepts to anyone that wants to listen and wants to be more informed about their health. And actually, what you've just said really resonates with me. Just about a post that I replied to this morning, I just put out the new pan, which is the English version of fruits and vegetables that are highest in pesticides and chemicals. And someone replied on my page saying, "Oh, and I thought all these foods were healthy." And actually, it was trying to then explain, but it's actually, that's just one tiny part of your environment, and you've explained that in a different way. It's not night and day. One doesn't just wake up with an autoimmune disease. It's about these predispositions and this layering effect of what you've just explained in your case of antibiotics that were used, the oral contraceptive pill that was used for acne. You then mentioned that you contracted the Epstein-Barr virus. So it's this continual layering of what we refer to as our environmental inputs across a genetic predisposition.
Exactly. I call that the immune lasagna. Right?
Oh,
all the layers that happen over time that ends up with an autoimmune disease. But it's very infrequently is it just one thing. You have to have those layers that happen.
fantastic. So we've got two analogies now. We've got a lasagna and we've got a rusty nail. I love it. Okay. This is a bit of a tricky question because so you explained and all of these different signs and symptoms and some sort of maybe red herring diagnoses like anemia. That's the cause. Are there sort of some standout red flag signs and symptoms that would alert you to the possibility of a rumbling of an autoimmune condition, not necessarily celiac but of an autoimmune condition? Is that too broad a question?
No, it's a great question. So it is a great question because autoimmunity can present in lots of different ways. So there are 80 distinct autoimmune diseases, and there are more than 150 different diseases that have autoimmunity as part of the mechanism for development. So there is a really wide and really broad range of symptoms that happen for people, and often those symptoms could be attributable to lots of different things as well. So people with autoimmunity often have a bunch of different diagnoses like IBS or like because it can look like something else, or because those symptoms are very common. We get told often that it's depression, or that it's even psychosomatic, or that it's stress, because a lot of the common symptoms of autoimmune disease are common in the community and attributable to a lot of different variables and different factors. But remember that common is not the same as normal. So just because it's happening to a lot of people doesn't mean that that's normal, and that doesn't mean something in the body. So I think probably the number one most common variable across all of the autoimmune diseases is fatigue. Yeah. So fatigue that isn't explained, fatigue that doesn't go away, fatigue that isn't helped if you sleep properly, fatigue that you still feel when you're on holidays or at the end of a holiday. Like fatigue, unexplained fatigue, or also fluctuating fatigue for me is a really big red flag. And then we've got pain, so muscle or joint pain. But in general, I would say symptoms that don't make sense, or symptoms that don't follow a pattern that can be easily recognized.
Mm.
So if you only eat McDonald's all day, every day, and there's no judgment in this statement, by the way, if that's you, then no judgment. But if you only eat McDonald's, then having some digestive symptoms makes sense. Right?
Sure.
That's 1 + 1 = 2, and that's not really it's not a medical mystery. But if you eat really, really well, and you make a lot of effort with your diet and you don't feel well, right?
Yeah.
There's a question mark there, right? So that becomes a red flag when symptoms don't make sense in the context of your life, or they don't follow a pattern that can be easily recognized. So if you always have muscle pain, if you always have knee pain after you hike 5 miles in the hills, that makes sense. But if sometimes you wake up with knee pain when you haven't really done anything the day before, or when there's no obvious pattern to it, then I'm starting to think about, could this be an autoimmune disease? And then another one that's a big red flag for me is a hyperreactive system. So people who are reacting to things that other people don't react to. So reacting to alcohol, alcoholic drinks, reacting to skin products, reacting to smells, reacting to things in your environment, reacting to foods, like food reactions that are unexplained or that move around or don't make sense or are getting worse over time. So that would indicate to me that your immune system is really struggling to tolerate your environment and to lots of different things in the environment. And then some other things would include like poor healing. If you're taking ages to recover from an eyebrow wax or from an incision of any kind, like one of the things for me being in Australia, but also being very fair, is that I've had a ton of moles taken off over time. And my moles, or the incision and the stitches always took months to heal, which should have taken 2 weeks. So my stitches always got infected, even if I took care. My dad was a nurse actually, so he took care of them, and they still didn't heal particularly well. I got big scars. They were red for sometimes 2 years. My scars would stay red for. So that kind of really poor healing, poor recovery. Susceptibility to infections. If you're someone who goes down at every infection but also struggles to recover, like something that takes somebody else in your family 3 days and it's taking you 4 weeks, right, that's a really significant immune red flag. So, and it can be lots of different patterns within that.
That is so, as always, articulately and beautifully put and explained. That is, I think there will be people sort of jumping up and down listening to this, sort of thinking, this is me, this is me. But that hypersensitivity is well, they're all big ones. They are all, but that, I think that will resonate, and it'll be a light bulb aha moment for a lot of people, and maybe and practitioners listening thinking, and they're thinking already, they're thinking of clients that, yeah, brilliant.
Yeah, you'll know if it's you. Like, I mean, I hope that from that sort of description, you will know, because you're that person who, you're sensitive, you're reactive, things don't always go quite to plan, medically speaking. And also you might have been looking for help. You might have been seeing your GP, and you know that there's something wrong, but your tests keep coming back normal. That's just, but in yourself that there's something that's not quite right. So if I'm speaking to you, keep looking for somebody who is prepared to look further.
Yeah, can guide you through it. Fantastic. There are, we know in functional medicine that all systems are related and connected, and there's an intersection. I would say that there is a particular relationship and special interest between the immune system and the endocrine, the hormone system, and the gastrointestinal system. There is this beautiful sort of segue, if you like. And so if we sort of just talk a little bit about hormones first, we notice that certainly in pregnancy, for example, that a lot of autoimmune conditions or symptoms of autoimmune conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, they tend to go into a holding pattern or into what is called remission. Could you explain that process a little bit?
Yeah, certainly. So there are estrogen receptors and androgen receptors as well. So hormone receptors on the cells of the immune system. So a hormone is a chemical messenger. It is a project manager, right, whose job it is to kind of roam around the body and make sure everybody's doing what they need to do. But specifically, they're giving a message for action. So the fact that there are hormone receptors on the immune system tells us that the immune system is is a conductor of the endocrine system, the hormone system, is a conductor of the immune system. It has the ability to send messages that change immune behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So estrogen, one of the things that estrogen does is that it can enhance the immune response to certain environmental triggers. So like infections, for example. So when you come across an infection, estrogen can make your defense against that infection bigger, which is supposed to be protective.
Mm-hmm.
But estrogen can also make the body make more of the cells that make antibodies and that make other autoimmune related reactions. So if somebody has very high estrogen, or they're not metabolizing their estrogen, then this mechanism, which should be protective, can go a little bit too far in that direction and make the immune response just a little bit overactive, I guess is probably the best way to do that. But one of the biggest correlations between hormones in women and the immune responses is actually not necessarily the level of hormones, but it's changes in the levels of the hormones. So when they swing around or when they drop. So, but of course, women's hormones actually work in cycles every month.
Exactly.
So there are some autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis or like lupus that can have peaks and troughs with the normal menstrual cycle. Yep. So MS actually can be worse in the premenstrual phase, or rheumatoid arthritis can be worse in the bleed week. And then there are other times of big changes like puberty. But then with pregnancy, there are two things happen with pregnancy, which is there is a big change in hormones, but there's also a big change in immunity. Where the immune system itself has to adapt to having a baby on board, which is a massive foreign body. So a lot of women, in order to tolerate the pregnancy, their immune system changes in a way that can sort of appear to switch off their autoimmunity because it's very, very dampened down. But then in the postpartum period, a lot of women flare because not only are the hormones dramatically dropping, so they've climbed up and up and up and up and up during the pregnancy, but without cycling like with a menstrual cycle where they're dropping up and down every month. There's a much more predictable trajectory of the hormones. Then you have the baby and they fall off a cliff. And then you also do this interesting thing postpartum where your immune system flops around about every 3 months. So your hormones are fluctuating, your immune system is fluctuating. So that postpartum period is a really big time of risk, especially that
window of vulnerability. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly, vulnerability. So people with autoimmunity can have a big flare during that postpartum period. People can develop new autoimmunity during that postpartum period as well. And then perimenopause and menopause is another time when our hormones are roller coastering all over the place, because it's really the fluctuation of the hormones rather than the level of hormones is probably the biggest risk factor there.
Brilliant. That's really illuminating. And this is why I think we see probably whether you'd agree, but one of the most common autoimmune conditions in women tends to be Hashimoto's, which is a thyroid condition. And this is very common to develop antibodies against the thyroid postpartum. And now this is certainly more than a hypothesis as to why.
Exactly. There's specifically a condition called postpartum thyroiditis, and it's incredibly common. And there's such a big correlation between postpartum thyroid issues and postpartum depression and postpartum mood and anxiety and fatigue and inability to cope as well as we would like. It's such a vulnerable time for women in many aspects. They're sleep deprived. There's a lot of things that happen in that postpartum period outside of hormonal changes and immune system changes that also create this big kind of immune lasagna, right? We're not sleeping, we're awaking constantly, we're very worried about this new little sausage that we have to take care of. We're much more difficult to eat and drink, so and women, being women, have a tendency to prioritize the baby's welfare over their own welfare. So we'll spend hours and hours and hours making and pureeing organic vegetable food for the baby to wean on, and then we will eat their leftovers and a cold fish finger instead of making meals for ourselves or sitting down. When the baby's asleep, we don't sleep. What we actually do is 7 loads of washing. and try to tidy up the house a little bit, or we catch up on our TV, or we lie there and cry.
Yeah.
So it's a rough period for women in general, but from an autoimmune perspective, there's lots of variables in there actually that make that a big risk factor.
But that circles back around again, doesn't it, into, okay, so what, not to feel, oh, of course it's very overwhelming, but it circles back round to, but what can we do? So it's about, as you said, sort of finding someone that is going to be on your team, which is what I see our role is being to guide and to help that individual see the wood for the trees. So
exactly,
yes, what is change? What are the variables in your environment right now that we can actually help to alleviate, empty the bucket, lighten the load, whatever the expression is?
Yeah. 100%. One of the beautiful things about autoimmune disease is that it can be so complicated and complex, but the most simple changes have a tendency to have a big impact, right? So 1 extra hour of sleep, if that's possible, chewing your food, right? The more you chew your food, the less reactive your immune system is to your food. So very simple interventions, how you get a lot of bang for your buck. So working with somebody who actually just supports you to understand, there's so much empowerment with autoimmunity. What are the changes you can make? What's the next step? What's the next step forward? That's all you actually have to think about. It doesn't need to be complicated. It's all about what you have the ability to change and knowing that those changes have a big impact.
Fantastic. Brilliant. And then so the other area of vulnerability, as you said, within the endocrine system, the hormone, is perimenopause, where there are huge fluctuations of unopposed estrogen, and that lovely flow is more of a roller coaster because we've got more of that sort of, and so that is another area of where women need that extra guidance and that support, because it's another sort of window of vulnerability.
Absolutely. And then actually the other thing that's not talked about as much, so perimenopause and menopause, definitely, because there's such a big time for change for women. The immune system and the endocrine system is going through such big changes during that time. And they, like you say, it's a roller coaster. It's such a ride. But the other thing is birth control, right? Hormonal birth control isn't talked about that much. And it's and I think that also is quite a discussion to have around autoimmunity, because there's not really a clear consensus. So there is some discussion that in some cases, hormonal birth control can actually be protective because it can help to stabilize the changes in the fluctuation pattern. So you get less roller coaster and more even variance in the hormonal changes. But then for other people, hormonal birth control can be a risk factor. So for example, it's a risk factor for Crohn's, but not for ulcerative colitis, which is interesting. And then it might be a risk factor for lupus, but then it might be protective in some cases of rheumatoid arthritis, unless there is something called citrullination, in which case it might be an increased risk. So hormonal birth control is also sometimes given when people are on immunosuppressive meds, especially if those immunosuppressive meds can cause miscarriages or birth defects. So it's a conversation that isn't really happening. And it's one of those that needs to be discussed because, again, hormonal birth control is considered normal.
But
considered normal, and therefore it's given out without much thought. But if you are at risk for autoimmunity, or if you are struggling with something, then whether or not your hormonal birth control is helping you or potentially making things worse needs to be a conversation that you have with your medical provider, and at least asking them to have that into consideration, because we're putting our girls on hormonal birth control from 13 or younger.
Yeah.
And it's some people are on it for life, so it's also can be a risk factor and isn't really part of the discussion as much.
I'd love to talk to you more about that. That's really interesting. And there is, which sort of segues into the other system, which is the gut, in terms of and the interplay with the microbiome. And I'm interested to ask you then, so do you know what that correlation is between why the oral contraceptive pill is the differential between ulcerative colitis and Crohn's? Is it to do with different diversity of species in the microbiome, or are you?
They don't know, because
Right,
the studies that have been done around it have just showed that there is definitely this delineation between those two diseases, but there's not a clear cut pathway that they've been able to identify as to why that would be one or the other. So it's very interesting, but it's not researched enough.
No, but I love that thought. But we do know that and in fact, I just was alerted to as a great paper in Nature that beautifully shows around the sort of correlation of different autoimmune diseases, and showing either more of a prevalence of certain overgrowth of species of bacteria in the gut. So, which I know that you know lots about. So could you maybe explain that a little bit to our listeners of what that correlation is that we know about so far?
Well, so the gut is fascinating and nice and complex. So we've got this, I think it's 2 kilos of bacteria and other microbial species that live in the gut. And while
2 kilos, just listen to that right there. Wow.
Yeah. Think about what 2 kilos of potatoes looks like, and then think about that in the context of bacteria. Right, it's a huge ecosystem, and it's not just bacteria, it's also viruses and yeasts and lots of different little microorganisms that live in there, but they're not really, so first of all, they're not separate from our immune system, right? So the bacteria that live there are part of our immune system. We've just slightly sort of outsourced some things to that microbial population. So without those microbes, we don't really have an immune system. But the second thing is that they're also an organ. So that bacteria is also considered an organ. So they are technically outside the body, because the interior of the gut is not technically inside the body, but it is also an organ of the body and an integral part of the immune system. So everything that happens in that microbial ecology directly interacts with our immune system, and that includes creating inflammation, tolerating, attacking. All of that is a communication that happens between the microbes and our immune cells directly themselves. So any changes in that population change the conversation that's happening in the body with the immune system. So there's lots of ways that the gut bacteria can be less healthy than we would like. So you can have not enough bacteria overall, not enough good guys, not enough bad guys.
Okay.
You can have not enough good guys, too many bad guys. You can have infection, or you can just have the good guys living in the wrong part of the gut. So that's also a part of it, is that every single part of our digestive tract has a different population of bacteria that are supposed to live there. So if you've got bacteria from the bowel that are living in the small intestine, or bacteria from the small intestine that have worked their way into the stomach, it's technically a good bacteria, but because it's in the wrong spot, it can't communicate properly with the body, and therefore the message that we're getting from that is problematic, even though it's technically a good guy. So it's all about communication, how the gut bacteria is sending messages to the body. And when you've got an overgrowth of a population, or that population's in the wrong spot, the message changes, and then that completely changes the way that the immune system works. But so what that means is we've got control, because we've got a lot of different tools that we can use to manipulate and maneuver the population of bacteria in the gut. And if we can change the population using food, for example, then we can change the message, and we can therefore change the way that the immune system works.
Brilliant. Absolutely astounding information, and as always, so beautifully put. So you just finished up there saying, like, for example, with food, what would you say then when you're mentoring and when you're sort of guiding your clinical guys through different cases? What would you say are the sort of foundational nutrients, that you would test for, that you feel are imperative to rule in or rule out? And then what would be the key non-negotiables for you in terms of trying to clear the decks and allow the immune system to be a little bit more modulated and balanced?
So nutrients. So my number one nutrient is vitamin D. I think that that's the big one because, again, when we talked about there being receptors on all of the immune cells for hormones, there's also receptors on all of the cells of the body for vitamin D. So vitamin D is one of our biggest immune modulators. So if I'm having to choose just one nutrient, that's the one that I'm looking at first.
Okay.
In order to optimize. I think it has the biggest impact to create change in the immune system when change is needed. Some of the other nutrients that I think are autoimmune superstars or immune system superstars include selenium, which is found in Brazil nuts.
Love it.
Zinc, which is found in pumpkin seeds and oysters and meats, or vitamin A, which is found in liver and in orange vegetables, so carrots and butternut squash and pumpkin. And all of those are required to help our immune system communicate properly and respond appropriately. So they're, probably the big four. So sunlight, and then healthy whole foods. But then there's also butyrate, which is not a vitamin, but butyrate is made by those gut bacteria that we were talking about. So in order to make butyrate, which is a fatty acid that's actually made in the gut, we need to have good gut bacteria, but we also need to eat a lot of good fiber and a lot of diverse fiber. So I'm not talking about Special K when I'm talking about fiber. Right? I'm not talking about
shredded wheat or...
Yeah, I'm really not.
Robyn and I have well, there's no love. We have a complete hate for packet cereal. Yes. We'll just put that out there.
Yeah, we do. If it has a health claim on it, it's probably trying to hide how bad it is for you. So if it's saying with added fiber, it's bad, right? Run as fast as you can. But I'm talking about lots of different diverse fruits and veggies and herbs and spices and, nuts and seeds and flax and, all of that really brilliant fiber helps to promote good gut bacteria. But then the gut bacteria turn the fiber, like they eat the fiber and they make this beautiful fatty acid, which is called butyrate. Okay. And then speaking of fatty acids, I also want to talk about oily fish and our omega-3s. So the butyrate and the omega-3s from the oily fish, both of those are super important for helping the immune system switch off properly at the end of an appropriate response to something like infection or injury. So they're really important for the immune system getting that message that it can stop acting now, and helping to switch things back into a balanced sort of resting state, which is very important in autoimmunity. And then lastly, color. Right. So again, color is not necessarily a nutrient specifically, but we want all of those really vivid colors of the plants. So the reds and the oranges and the yellows and the greens and the blues and the purples and the whites and the browns that we see in mushrooms and chickpeas and ginger and garlic and onions. When we're talking about whites and browns, we're not talking about baked beans and sausage and toast. Because the chemicals that are in those colors in plants help those plants actually communicate to our genes. They help those foods communicate with our immune systems and with our brains, and they help us to have a really healthy and robust microbiome as well. So they really also help to modulate that community of bacteria and microbes that we find in the gut there.
Excellent. So you need to press pause on this on minute 42 or 40, and just whenever you're in the kitchen, just listen to Robyn reel through, conjuring up all those colors and motivation for you to incorporate as much of that in your day and then week and month as possible, because there's a really, there's so much gemful information in there, but there was a particular part that I want to sort of just wind back to in terms of when Robyn was talking about essential fatty acids. So from oily fish, she talked about they provide nutrients that provide this switch, if you like, that allow for an appropriate immune response, but then to allow what we call resolution. So it's like the autoimmunity is this big wave that's building in the sea, and then we want it to kind of crash onto the shore, but there to be then calm. And that is what we call resolution. And these essential fatty acids are so important as they're called pro-resolvins that facilitate that calm and resolution to occur. And I just think she put all of that so beautifully. It's a gem. It's an absolute gem.
Well, very beautifully summarized. Thank you so much. Great analogy.
So before I let you go, could I ask you one more question?
Absolutely.
Thank you. So if we sort of people listening, sort of we've I think you've summed up sort of foods beautifully. If we could sort of go back to thinking about root causes and that sort of if we think about everybody has their own personal, what are my triggers? What's my environment? What would you say? And I sort of tend to sort of divide these into sort of inflammatory signals, sort of dysregulated blood sugar, circadian rhythm, mental and emotional sort of, and nutrient depletions. Are there what would you sort of group as your sort of foundational areas from there that you would pick out to say, okay, let's work on these for you because of your case history? Is there sort of a little thought process that you have around that?
It's so interesting to hear you describe your clinical sort of mechanism for organizing that information, because I think about things I divide it in half first. So with autoimmunity, I'm thinking about what are your specific triggers of autoimmunity. So for me, for example, mine is gluten. This is specific to me. If I eat gluten, it triggers an autoimmune attack on my body, but it's not true for my husband. If he eats gluten, he doesn't have autoimmunity as a result of that. So that is a specific trigger. And another one of my specific triggers is Epstein-Barr virus. But everybody, 95% of the population has Epstein-Barr virus. And for the majority of those people, it is not an autoimmune trigger. So I'm thinking for everybody that I'm working with, I'm thinking about, we have to identify what are your specific triggers of autoimmunity. And then there are categories in which, and I'll slightly come back to that, because there are categories within the specific triggers that I look at. But then the other side, so when I say I split things into specific triggers, but then the second one is general inflammation. So what are the things that are always inflammatory for everybody? Mm-hmm. So dysregulated blood sugar, right? That is always inflammatory. It's true for you. It's true for me. It's true for Bob down the street. In inadequate amounts of sleep, right? So less than 7 hours of sleep for everybody. And I find that people find that number shocking. People think about inadequate sleep as being 4 hours or 5 hours, but 7 hours or less is a pro-inflammatory. And that is true for everybody, no matter how much coffee you drink. Right, so that's always true. But there's a lot. So sleep, stress, blood sugar, the diet that you're eating, whether or not it's pro-inflammatory or anti-inflammatory, nutrient deficiencies, right? All of those things are always pro-inflammatory, and inflammation drives autoimmunity in somebody who is susceptible. So there's so much power in that. If you never know what your specific triggers are, you've got all of this.
Strength if you've got 50%, you've got
control is the word I was looking for. You've got so much control over your body in your case by working with those general inflammatory triggers and inflammatory variables. Chemicals is another one, like environmental chemicals inside the home. So you can choose not to be using Glade plugins, and you can choose not to be using acrylic nails. Like all of those things help with reducing the inflammatory burden and helping your body to be healthy. And then within the specific triggers, I've got 4 categories there. So stress and trauma is category number 1. Foods is number 2, because for some people turmeric can drive the autoimmune process, even though turmeric is generally anti-inflammatory. So foods, infections, viruses, bacteria, mold, yeast. And then chemicals is the last one. So they're the 4 categories of things that I'm assessing in everybody to see if there is anything in those 4 buckets that is directly driving their autoimmune disease.
Brilliant. Just fantastic. Robyn, it is just such a joy. For those of you listening, Robyn and I can see each other, so it's even more of a joy just and we both gesticulate like crazy. talk with our hands. So it is just such a pleasure. I hope you will come back again onto the pod and talk to us again and share knowledge. And I'm thrilled to be working with you on your AFM MP program early next year with some of your students. And I hope that we can catch up in a lecture hall in person and I can give you a massive hug soon.
I look forward to it. I will come on your podcast anytime you want me to come. We've got, I'm sure, weeks of things that we could talk about.
Oh, we have.
Because we both get lit up by the same by the same passion for this industry and knowledge, and all of that. We love diving down all the pathways and talking about inflammasomes in great detail. It's always been our bag. Thank you so much for having me. It's really been such a pleasure.
Brilliant. See you on the other side. Lots of love.
Lots of love.